Puizo Soguila, who works for the Hungarian Tax Authority, and he was talking about the ongoing protests in Ukraine caused by the government's decision to suspend its European Union integration drive. Now, joining me live on the phone is Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, the editor of Politics First magazine. Welcome to the show, Doctor.
Hello there.
Hello. Now, how could you comment, or how would you comment on some people's urge in the Ukraine to have closer ties with the EU?
Well, I think that Ukraine has come to a crossroads whereby it can't keep on flirting with the European Union and Russia indefinitely. And this has been going on for the last 20 years, indeed, since Ukraine had its independence. But I think it's somewhat worrying what we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment, because, of course, Ukrainians need to decide amongst themselves. They're a sovereign, independent nation. They need to decide amongst themselves whether they want to be of the European Union or whether they want to forge closer relations and become a member of the customs union of Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. But it's very unclear as to what level of information is being put out to ordinary Ukrainians about the benefits of joining the European Union. All we hear are European Union officials talking about if Ukraine joins the family of Europe, there'll be greater prosperity, more democracy, more opportunities, and it will safeguard Ukraine's future. Well, that's a very simplistic approach to make, and I think that it's as I said earlier, it's disconcerting because we have a lot of violent protests going on in Ukraine at the moment, and the protesters do not represent the whole of the country. But the way that EU officials and Western mainstream journalists are talking about these protests, it's almost as if the whole of Ukraine has made up its mind and wants to join the European Union. Well, that's not the case whatsoever. And on another note, the fact that there are EU officials and European politicians going to Ukraine, to a sovereign independent country, and urging for the people to rise up, to oppose the government, I mean, that's completely in violation of state sovereignty. That's completely in violation of the norms of the United Nations. These politicians should not be travelling to another country and encouraging what I would argue is effectively a coup against the democratically elected government of Ukraine.
Well, it does seem like they are doing something strange. It seems like they're asking for an insurrection, and it seems that they're egging the people on to continue doing this. Let's step back for a moment. And how would you assess the political and economic aspects of Ukraine's stance on the EU?
Well, that's been the big question building up to whether Ukraine last week was going to sign the agreement in Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. What can the European Union offer Ukraine? The European Union is in a dire state at the moment. You only have to look at Greece and Cyprus, where the economies, where the banking sectors have collapsed. So what really is in it for ordinary Ukrainians, even those Ukrainians that are saying, and they have every right to hold this opinion, that they want to be of the European Union, just how much do they know about the European Union? Just how much do they know that the European Union would be good for them economically? And then we need to take a brutally realistic assessment of the situation with the Ukrainian economy. The Ukrainian economy is very closely tied to the economy of Russia. Now, that's a fact. When we hear talk about the Orange Revolution of 2004 and Viktor Yushchenko coming to power in this revolution, well, the fact that he failed to do anything meaningful in Ukraine shows that Ukraine is not just economically, but culturally, historically, and politically tied to Ukraine. And that's a very, very important observation here, because the Orange Revolution, there was no such thing as a revolution. If it really was a revolution, then Ukraine would be probably well on the road by now to becoming a member of the European Union. There is not the level of anti-Russian sentiment in Ukraine which Western mainstream media outlets are alleging. That's just not the case. You'll find the regions of Ukraine where there is anti-Russian sentiment in the westernmost regions, turmoil, for example, Galicia, for example, but the rest of the Ukrainian population is culturally tied to the Russians. They're part of the East Slav family. The Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are from the same family, and they share the same first state in their history, Kiev and Rus. So what Ukraine can really get out of the European Union is the $64,000 question. What level of information is being given out to ordinary Ukrainians about the benefits is another big question. I mean, I can say, being a journalist in Britain, there's hardly any talk about the European Union and what it's about in the British press. The only thing you find in the British press is severe criticisms of the European Union. So one would suspect that if that's the case in Britain, a major member state of the EU, it's probably going to be even worse in Ukraine.
Well, that's a very interesting take on the situation. Let's look forward here. And what's going to happen in the Ukraine? How would this situation in Ukraine develop in the future?
Well, Ukraine is an independent, sovereign country. Its president, Viktor Yanukovych, was democratically elected in 2010. It is up to the Ukrainian population to decide which way their country goes. But it's completely unacceptable for outside interference in Ukraine, and we're seeing that from Western politicians. And it's unacceptable for the protesters to use violent methods on the streets of Kiev. You know, we're hearing, for example, on the BBC, that there are protests in Kiev for freedom, and the police have used violence against them. Well, let's have a look at the footage we saw yesterday. We saw the protesters driving a tractor into the police. We saw the protesters throwing all sorts of dangerous objects at the police. We saw the protesters gaining entry into government buildings and ransacking them. So that's something that should not be tolerated and should be condemned. And indeed, if it happened on the streets of a Western capital in the European Union, there'd be condemnation from EU officials. So the Ukrainian government needs to be left alone to decide what is in the best interests of Ukraine. And there can't be any pressure put on the Ukrainian government. And this, as I said at the beginning of the interview, because there's a lot of protesters on the streets of Kiev who undoubtedly have been encouraged by outside forces, why is it assumed that that means they're right, the Ukrainian government needs to leave office, a new government needs to come in, and Ukraine needs to join the European Union? I mean, that's absolutely ludicrous, that is. I mean, when did that become the rule or the norm? When there are protests in a country, the government accepts the protests, accepts the violence, and a new government comes to power, and the new government takes the country in the direction of what some people want. That's not democracy. We're hearing all sorts of preposterous nonsense at the moment that the protesters in Ukraine, all they want is freedom. Well, in a country where there's no freedom, there's no elections. In a country where there's no freedom, there's no protests. And in a country where there's no freedom, there's no government offices being taken over by protesters and ransacked by protesters. Now, all three things we have in Ukraine. There are presidential elections, there are parliamentary elections, there are protests, as we're seeing at the moment, and there are government buildings being taken over and being ransacked. So there is democracy in Ukraine. There is freedom in Ukraine. But, of course, it's a Hollywood version of events that's being put out at the moment by Western governments and by EU officials.
Dr. Papadopoulos?
In the Ukraine, there is no freedom.
We have to wrap up this section, but I would just like to comment very briefly. You mentioned about the demonstrators, and they were throwing objects at police. You even mentioned that there was a tractor. Well, throwing objects at the police sounds like a criminal act to me. And not only that, but where did they get the tractor? Was this tractor driven into the city, or did somehow maybe some of the protesters stole it? Yet again, another criminal act. But unfortunately, on this note...
I don't know where they got the tractor from, but you're absolutely right. They are illegal acts. And, violence should be condemned unequivocally. It's as simple as that. If this was happening in Paris, in Berlin, in Madrid, there would be condemnation from EU officials. Violence should be categorically opposed and condemned.
Wonderful. And on that note, I'd like to say thank you for joining us. And speaking to us live from London was Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, the editor of the Politics First magazine.